So, in today's class, we will be talking about archives and museum, as this topic suggests, and you know about this paper. This paper is about archives and museums. So, today we will be talking about how it is preserved and how museum and archives are preserved and conserved. So, we will be talking about preservation and conservation of archive and museum. So we see that when we try to analyze the contribution into the preservation and conservation of museum. So if we try to phase it out, that what are the different phases in which its documentation and its preservation is conducted, and what are the different phases when we see that any work for preservation of archives or museum is done, or preservation of Indian heritage for that matter. So we see that the study of ancient and medieval Indian art and architecture in the modern scientific manner, it only emerged about 2 centuries ago, after the arrival of Europeans. When Europeans came to India, this study of preservation and conservation, it emerged. But preservation and conservation, it emerged. But when we see that but before that also there are some instances शुरू 200 शुरू हुआ। तो एक ब्रेक की तरह देखते हैं, अगर हम एक हेरिटेज को कब शुरू हुआ, कि हाउ जब हम देखते हैं कि एक्चुअल में कब प्रिजर्वेशन और एज ए कब इंडियन हेरिटेज को मेंटेन करने के लिए, इसको प्रिजर्व करने के लिए आर्काइव को और म्यूजियम को, हेरिटेज को कब शुरू हुआ। अगर हम एक प्रॉपर डिसिप्लिन की तरह देखते हैं, अगर हम देखते हैं कि प्रॉपर सब्जेक्ट कब शुरू हुआ, तो ये ब्रिटिशर्स के आने के बाद शुरू हुआ, ये यूरोपियंस के आने के बाद शुरू हुआ, जो कि करीब करीब 2 सेंचुरीज पहले है, करीब करीब 200 साल 300 साल पहले की बात है। ठीक है, उसके पहले जैसा कि हमें पता है कि हम लोग बहुत ज्यादा इतिहास को प्रिजर्व करने में, या इतिहास के बनाए हुए चीजों को प्रिजर्व करने में, या किसी भी तरह का मॉन्यूमेंट्स, किसी भी तरह का जो हमारा इंडियन हेरिटेज होता है, उसको प्रिजर्व करने में हमारी कुछ बहुत ज्यादा रुचि नहीं होती थी, या हमारे पास कोई इसका आधुनिक तरीका नहीं होता था जिसके आधार पे हम इसको प्रिजर्व कर सकते थे। सो बेसिकली दिस इंटायर, इफ यू ट्राई टू टॉक अबाउट डिसिप्लिन ऑफ preservation and maintenance and preservation of archive and museum as a discipline, then we see that it only started about 2 centuries ago when European came to India. So the rediscovery of the ancient and rich artistic tradition of India began only in late 18th and 19th century. We know that there were empire in India, there were different kingdoms in India like Maurya, Sultanate, Mughal, or Gupta. There were different empires who contributed numerously in the making of different building or architectural masterpiece. But we did not have any proper way to maintain, or proper way to conserve, to preserve it. So if we try to look when this started, how we started rediscovering our ancient monuments or in ancient artistic tradition which were there in the India. हमें प्रिजर्व करने का, या हमें एक प्रॉपर डिसिप्लिन नहीं था इसे प्रिजर्व करने के लिए, इसे समझने के लिए। लेकिन चूंकि भारत में हम देखते हैं कि बहुत राज साम्राज्य और बहुत ही राजा लोग राज किए हैं भारत में, बहुत ही साम्राज्य उत्पन्न हुआ है, तो बहुत सारे मॉन्यूमेंट्स, बहुत सारे इन चीजों का हम देखते हैं कि आधार भी बनता है भारत में होती बनते रहती है, लेकिन उसके बारे में पढ़ाई जो शुरू होती है, it only began in late 18th and 19th century during the period of British colonial rule in India. So it is then that the process of retrieving, conserving, and understanding the nuances of the culture of the colonized people. So because why Britishers wanted to study Indian culture, why they wanted to study Indian tradition, they wanted to study Indian culture or Indian tradition because they wanted to rule this place, and to rule this place it is very important to understand how they behaved in past, right? So this is the reason we see that they wanted to study past of India. They wanted to study the past. क्या क्या हुआ अतीत में, उसे समझने के लिए हम देखते हैं कि अंग्रेज लोग जो है वो इन चीजों को, मॉन्यूमेंट्स को, जो इंस्क्रिप्शंस जैसे अशोका के अभिलेख होते थे या दूसरे तरह के जो इंस्क्रिप्शंस ये सब होते थे, उसको समझने के लिए, या कोई लैंड ग्रांट्स दिया जाता था, उसको समझने के लिए हम देखते हैं कि ब्रिटिशर्स जो हैं वो पास्ट को समझने की कोशिश करते हैं, पास्ट को पढ़ने की कोशिश करते हैं, क्योंकि इस तरीके से वे लोग अंदाजा लगा सकते थे कि कैसे हम इस जगह को रूल कर सकते हैं, कैसे हम इस जगह को कंट्रोल कर सकते हैं, ठीक है? So it is then that the process of retrieving, conserving, and understanding the nuances of the culture of the colonized people. They wanted to understand the culture of colonized people. They wanted to understand the culture of Indian people. They wanted to understand entire mentality, entire everything about colonial people, about Indian people. And on the basis of that, they thought if we understand them completely with the help of these monuments, or with the help of these archival resources, then it will be easy for us to rule them, to control them, right? So this is the reason that their scripts, they wanted to understand the scripts of Indian, languages of Indian, religions of Indian, text, art, archaeological remains. So all kind of activities which were there in the present, which was there in the past, which Europeans believed, which Britishers believed, that if we try to understand everything about India's past, then it will be easy for us to rule this country. It will be easy for us to understand this country, and with the help of that understanding, it can be ruled, right? So this is the reason we see that they try to study India's past in the form of different things, either it is scripts, languages, religions, texts, art, archaeological evidences, architecture, anything, painting, anything. Okay. So in order to assess the contribution made by Western scholars in studying, documenting, and management of Indian heritage, it is true that they wanted to study these things, they wanted to explore these things only for their benefit. They wanted to rule India peacefully, they wanted to rule India in a better way. That's why they wanted to study these things. But we cannot deny this fact that due to Britishers, we started taking seriously our monuments, our past, and we also started writing about our past. We also started thinking about our past. So this can be said it was the important contribution in Indian scenario. So in order to assess the contribution made by the Western scholars in studying, documenting, and management of the Indian heritage, it is important that one needs to look into individual as well as institutional efforts that were made in pre-independence India as well as independent India, because it was started in pre-independence India. आजादी के पहले शुरू हुआ, लेकिन हम चूंकि एक बार शुरू हो चुका था, एक दिशा दिखाया जा चुका था, तो आजादी के बाद भी हम देखते हैं कि इसको प्रिजर्व करने के लिए, इसको कंजर्व करने के लिए बहुत सारे नीति सरकार के द्वारा लाए गए। ठीक है? So while one assesses the contribution of individuals and institutions, it also becomes imperative to contextualize their contributions in order to understand the implication of personal biases, prejudice, political ideologies, etc., on the study, documentation, and management of Indian heritage. Now we will talk about different period when we can see the development of this preservation and conservation of Indian heritages in our archives or museum. So the first period is between 1784 to 1870, 1784 से लेके 1870 तक. So the intellectual environment, we see that during this time there was enlightenment happening in Western Europe, and what enlightenment was actually. I would like to talk about enlightenment. थोड़ा सा. What happened that British population was fed up with not only British but European population was fed up with all the involvement of church and all the religious practices which were there in the society. So they wanted to reform their society. They wanted to make changes. So some of the philosophers of the time, like Rousseau, Voltaire, Montesquieu, they started giving their philosophy. They started talking about nature. They said that the church who wanted to control population, who wanted to control people with the help of religion, with the help of church, they started challenging church and they started challenging religion, and they said it is true that universe was created by God, but we cannot say that God is to interfere in the day-to-day life of universe. It is they believed in deism, and in deism, what is that they do not deny the existence of God, but according to them, what is that universe is like a machine which is created by God, and now machine is functioning on its own, right? So due to this intellectual environment which of 18th century of Europe, we see that due to that intellectual environment, they also wanted to study Indian civilization. So the intellectual environment of late 18th century made study of Indian civilization possible and gave birth to archaeology. It's associated with the name Sir William Jones. The first important name which we see in the conservation and the preservation of archaeology is Sir William Jones. So on January 15, 1784, 15 January 1784, under the initiative and guidance of Sir William Jones, the Asiatic Society for Inquiring into the History, Antiquities, Arts, Sciences and Literatures of Asia was founded in Calcutta. So the establishment of the society provided a great fillip to Asian studies. In 1788, a journal called Asiatic Researchers was started, and in 1814, a museum was established to house the objects collected by the workers of the society. Indian archaeology is most indebted to Sir William Jones, and he established linkages between Chandragupta Maurya and Alexander the Great. Today we see how Alexander invaded India, and during that time how Chandragupta Maurya came to power and everything. There was war between Porus and Chandragupta, and how Chandragupta became victorious, and how matrimonial alliances was established. So these linkages between Chandragupta Maurya and Alexander was established by Sir William Jones, who is credited to be the first person who is associated to archaeology, and he also started the Asiatic Society on January 15, 1784. So he established linkages between Chandragupta Maurya and Alexander the Great, providing Indian archaeology with its first positive date. So in 1788, Charles Wilkins, who was another important scholar or archaeologist associated to Indian archaeological system, in 1788 we see Charles Wilkins, a close associate of Jones, unlocked the mysteries of the Gupta as well as the Kuchila script and laid the foundation of epigraphical studies in India. So in 1800, what happened that Lord Wellesley, who was deputed to Francis Buchanan to survey Mysore. So Lord Wellesley deputed Francis Buchanan लॉर्ड वेलेस्ली क्या करते हैं 1800 में कि फ्रांसिस बुचानन को बोलते हैं कि आप मैसूर का सर्वे कीजिए, और 1807 में बुचानन वाज अगेन डिप्यूटेड टू सर्वे द टोपोग्राफी, हिस्ट्री एंड एंटिक्विटीज ऑफ बंगाल. First he was assigned in 1800 to survey Mysore, and in 1807 he was again assigned to survey Bengal. And for the next 8 years, 8 सालों तक हम देखते हैं कि बुचानन जो है he surveyed the districts of दिनाजपुर, रंगपुर, पूर्णिया, भागलपुर, पटना, Sahabad, Gorakhpur. These are the important places where he surveyed. Francis Buchanan conducted his survey, and though his report was never published, what little of it was made available in 1838 by Montgomery Martin gives an idea of keenness and accuracy of his observation. So, yet the real impetus for archaeological research came from the remarkable James Prinsep, who was the presiding genius of the early period. We see that Alexander Cunningham and Falconer both stressed his burning, irrepressible enthusiasm, which led him to accomplish the work of a dozen men. And in the late 18th century and through a major part of 19th century, we see that it grew out a keen and unrelenting interest in Indian antiquities, as curiosity, as admirable handicrafts, as mysterious monstrosities, and above all, as artifacts to show or sources of past histories of a country then colonized by the British. So these objectives set the tone for and determined the methods adopted in the study of Indian archaeology and art history during the 19th and early decades of the 20th century. So despite the marked colonial bias, this period is crucial to the formal inception and institutionalization of art history in India. Art and the interpretation of India's past survey, documentation, archiving the potential of the visual artifact in comprehending India's past was well appreciated by the British antiquarians of the 19th century, even as steps were being taken during the period to understand Indian history and culture through written records. So the setting of the Ascetic Society of Bengal in 1784 by William Jones had institutionalized the study of India's past. And we see that for Jones, however, we see the remains of architecture and sculpture were more monuments of antiquity and not specimens of art, which seemed to share their origins with the art of Africa. So at the same time, he lamented the loss of Siplakastras, which was the treatise, which he felt may have contained important information on traditional Indian arts and manufactures. So in fact, it was a handicraft or manufacture that Indian art first evoked British interest. Art and architectural remains received some attention as part of the regional survey undertaken to understand the geography, history, customs, language, literature, and folklore of the people. So important work emerged from individual initiatives such as those of Colin Mackenzie. If we talk about the time period of Colin Mackenzie, it is 1754 to 1821. So working with a team of draftsmen and learned Indians or Pandits, Mackenzie acquired translation of inscriptions and manuscripts and had detailed maps and drawing of some southern Indian sites prepared. So his efforts at documenting the Amravati Stupa and site are of particular art historical significance. Several traditional Indian scholars played an important part in the colonial project of recovering India's past, but were usually assigned subordinate roles. So the study of written sources to interpret varied aspects of cultural history, however, remained more or less detached from the object or monument-centric approach to Indian art and architectural history. So descriptions of ancient and medieval Indian monuments had been part of the travelogues of European travelers during the 16th and 17th centuries. Visual records of India's built heritage and landscape found representation in the acquaintance and paintings of artists such as William Hodge. He is researching during the time of 1744 to 1787 and the Daniels in 1795 to 1808. So, picturesque view of Indian monuments in ruins or those covered in dense forest or prolonged neglect were favorite subjects that were painted, published, and displayed at exhibition in Europe. So we can see how Europeans or how Britishers were taking very much interest in Indian monuments, and those monuments were neglected for uh, were neglected for many years, and they were in forest. That also we see that those how those monuments were studied, how those buildings were studied by Britishers or Europeans, we can say. So these early attempts acquired rigor and greater scientific basis from the mid 19th century. The most significant contribution of the period lay in the method of extensive survey and documentation, archiving and reporting, all through the image as acquaintant, drawing, plaster cast, lithograph, stereoscope, diorama, and finally photograph were sought after. Painstakingly prepared, archived, and commented upon, the incipient stages of the photographic juncture in the colonial history of Indian art are are addressed as a photo essay in this volume by Jacob Podge. We see that Balls discusses rare photographs now in private collection taken from Delhi fort during the time of mutiny of 1857 and correlates this with a diary maintained by Lady Copeland, a British who spent almost 5 months and a half taking refuge inside the Delhi fort during the mutiny. Balch then uses another sequence of photographs taken from the fort of Agra in 1902 to weave a conceptual visual narrative of the monuments of medieval Agra as understood by the British in earlier 20th century. So, seen together, the two photo narratives offer important insights into British reception of and their despotism towards the monuments of the preceding Mughal era. In doing so, the interactions of these monuments as symbols of appropriation, power, strategy, control, and empire with the intended purposes and aesthetics of the monuments at the time of their making are brought to the fore. So Bodge thus convincingly demonstrates important crossover between issues of spectatorship, ideology, and aesthetic in art historical studies. The visual had thus become an important tool of analysis for cultural interpretation and historical reconstruction during the British colonial period. Despite the biases and drawbacks, we see that image-centric approach did have its advantage and left a lasting agency in the scientific documentation of artifacts, archival and museum collections and display, and knowledge dissemination system in art, historical and museum studies. Yet this was also the period that witnessed the apathetic loss of India's material heritage and the mass exodus of art remains from India into the hands of private collectors and museums abroad. So stabilizing art historical constructs in colonial India from style Provence's period among those who pioneered a methodological study of Indian art and architecture. James Ferguson, his time period is 1808 to 1886, He is well known for his systematic study of Indian architectural history, and Alexander Cunningham, whose time period is 1814 to 1893, is remembered for laying the foundation of Indian archaeology. So both believed in the superiority of Western aesthetics, techniques, and canons, and categorized the material remains of India's past with colonial constructs. Attempts by some Indian scholars such as Ram Raj 1790 to 1813 and Rajendra Lal Mitra 1822 to 1891 to interpret Indian art history in the context of its specific cultural matrix and to engage with its textual and regional coordinates did not find many takers until much later. Ram Raj was in fact the first to study Indian monuments in relation to indigenous architectural texts and the living tradition of architect sculptors. His works are recorded in the posthumously published essay on the architecture of the Hindus. The shared genesis of the modern disciplines of archaeology and art history in 19th century India and the circumstances and motivations that determined the early framework of Indian art history are discussed in this volume by Upinder Singh and Gautam Sen Gupta. I think you must be aware about Upinder Singh, who is one of the renowned historian of Department of India, and she was there in Department of History, University of Delhi. In her contribution, we see that archaeologists and architectural scholars in 19th century India, Singh draws attention to little known aspects of Cunningham's important contributions to Indian art and architectural history. In doing so, she also focuses on the place accorded to art historical issues in the activities of the Archaeological Survey of India during the later half of the 19th century. Cunningham is better known for his emphasis on excavation, field and archival documentation systems, and for prioritizing inscriptional and numismatic data. A history of art history and the Indian context over the evidence of art and architecture. We see that for Cunningham, the scope of archaeology was very broad and included many different aspects that could help to illuminate the study of the past. He documented and wrote about large corpus of monuments in his capacity as archaeological surveyor between 1861 to 1865 and as the first Director General of Archaeological Survey of India 1871 to 1885. Bhupinder Singh intensely researched work reveals insightful details about subtle shifts in Cunningham text conceptual understanding of the early Buddhist sculpture and architecture. This can be detected in his observation on the art remains at Bhilsa Tops, Barhot, and Bodh Gaya, all Buddhist sites on the trail of the conflicting of the term symptomatic of the larger preoccupations of the period are revisited and candidly analyzed by Bhupinder Singh. We see that there is distinct approach from Cunningham, James Ferguson, with a clear focus on architectural history, attempted to understand Indian architecture in a global context and through the comparative method. This is apparent in his history of architecture in all countries and historical inquiry into the true principles of beauty in art, especially with reference to architecture. His passion for arriving at general principles, processes, criteria, and canons of architecture through extensive surveys and illustrated records has rarely been matched. He documented and attempted to read the monument to its last detail, treating it as a fixed and hence the most reliable source of cultural interpretation. So we see that his focus was on the artistic and technical processes of its making and on the period and region styles. So he did not consult texts and inscriptions, Yet he evinced interest in Indian mythology and religion, as is evident in his tree and serpent worship. So, although culture specific and textured readings of Indian architecture were alien to him, his observations convinced him of the integrity and rationale of ancient and medieval Indian architectural forms and ornaments. According to him, Egyptian classical work and Indian architecture represented true styles as opposed to the imitative styles seen during the revival of the classical and the Gothic in Europe. Gothic in Europe. Ferguson macro surveys and comparative approach were full of insights, lithographs, drawings, and finally photographs, greatly aided in generating more precise documentation, and it helped in understanding the Indian art and architecture. So these were the important aspects of Indian art and architecture and conservation and preservation of uh, archives and museum. आप लोग हिंदी मीडियम के, मुझे तो बताया गया कि इंग्लिश मीडियम की क्लास है। तो बेसिकली हम लोग देखते हैं कि जो कोई भी आर्काइवल रिसोर्सेस होता है ना, जिसको प्रिजर्व, जैसे हम लोग लाल किला देखते हैं या कोई भी आर्काइव में कभी चले जाइए या कोई इंस्क्रिप्शन जो अभिलेख होता है, उसको प्रिजर्व या कंजर्व कैसे किया जाता है। इसके लिए हम देखते हैं कि जिसकी जो शुरुआत होती है वो अंग्रेजों के आने के बाद होती है, क्योंकि उसके पहले इंडियंस में बहुत ज्यादा इनको प्रिजर्व करने का शौक कह लीजिए या रुचि कह लीजिए, वो नहीं होती थी। तो अंग्रेज जब आए तो अंग्रेज इसको पढ़ना शुरू किए, जो पास्ट में आर्कियोलॉजिकल साइट्स थे, जो बिल्डिंग्स थी, जो अभिलेख थे, उसको पढ़ना शुरू किए। क्यों उसको पढ़ना शुरू किए? क्योंकि वो इंडिया के लोगों को जानना चाहते थे, और इंडिया के लोगों को तभी जान सकते थे जब इनके बारे में पढ़े, जब इनके बारे में जाने। तो जानने के लिए, पढ़ने के लिए उन्होंने इन चीजों को पढ़ना शुरू किया, जिससे वो और बेहतर तरीके से इंडिया के लोगों को जान सके और उन पे रूल कर सके। ठीक है, इसलिए हम देखते हैं कि आर्काइव और कंजर्वेशन, इसकी जो पढ़ाई आर्कियोलॉजिकल एविडेंस की, आर्काइव म्यूजियम की पढ़ाई शुरू होती है। ये शुरू होती है अंग्रेजों के आने के बाद। अंग्रेजों के आने के बाद हम देखते हैं कि अंग्रेजों के आने के बाद हम देखते हैं कि 18th सेंचुरी और 19th सेंचुरी में इस पे बहुत ज्यादा जोर डाला जाता है, क्योंकि 18th सेंचुरी में यूरोप में रेनेसां इनलाइटनमेंट हो रहा है, जिससे बहुत सारे फिलोसोफर जैसा रूसो, वोल्टेयर, मोंटेस्क्यू, ये सब फिलोसोफर्स बातें कर रहे हैं, फिलोसफी अपना दे रहे हैं कि कैसे धर्म जो है वो अलग अलग लोगों के लिए अलग अलग धर्म नहीं होना चाहिए, या भगवान जो है वो भेदभाव नहीं करते हैं, बल्कि सबके लिए सेम है, नेचर कैसे सबके लिए सेम है। इन्हीं बात होती थी इनलाइटनमेंट में यूरोप में, और उसी का असर हम इंडिया में भी देखते हैं। और जो इनलाइटनमेंट थिंकर्स वहाँ पे बात करते हैं, उसी की बात हम देखते हैं कि इंडिया में भी उसी के कारण से इंडिया में इन चीजों की पढ़ाई शुरू हुई, इनका कंजर्वेशन, इनका प्रिजर्वेशन शुरू हुआ, और इनका प्रिजर्वेशन शुरू हुआ। और इसके कारण से हम देखते हैं कि आज इवन प्री इंडिपेंडेंस, जब ब्रिटिश का टाइम था उस समय, और उसके बाद भी आज भी हम देखते हैं कि इसी कारण से, चूंकि प्रिजर्वेशन कंजर्वेशन ब्रिटिशर्स शुरू किए, उसको अभी भी हम देखते हैं कि काफी गवर्नमेंट उस पर देख रेख पे खर्चा करती है, देख रेख करने की जिम्मा उठाई है। तो कुल यही बात है, बाकी हम लोग अगले क्लास में करेंगे। कोई सवाल है आज के क्लास से लेकर?